Good evening, everybody. Good evening. Glad to see all of you here tonight for our, I don't know what number this is now, fourth installment. Stop it, Cammy. That's our fourth installment of our Church Talks. And tonight we have with us my friend Lin Veasey from Covenant Presbyterian Church. Should I say Covenant Presbyterian PC USA? Okay. And so you'll find, maybe tonight you'll find Presbyterians have just as many letters and names as we do as Baptists. So thank you for being here tonight, Lynn. And I'm just going to ask a word of blessing, and we'll begin our time tonight. So let us go to the Lord in prayer. Eternal God, we are again grateful for the wide tent that is the church. And God, tonight we pray your blessing on our time. Pray your Holy Spirit will be here. Open our minds that we may learn, our hearts, Lord, that we may receive what it is you have for us, that we may be the collected and gathered people that you call us to be. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. You'll come on.
Evening. It's great to see. I've got lots of people here I know. Lorelai's here with one of her very favorite people in the world, Miss Marilyn, who was with her at Children's House. And those of you who know Lorelai, she's a theater and song person, and Miss Marilyn is the one who so graciously started her on that way, and we are just so thankful for that. And thrilled to be here with Chris. I want to say about three things of what I am not. I am not the spokesperson for the Presbyterian Church USA. Of all the things in life I'm sure about, I am sure about that. That is what I am not. I'm also not a cradle Presbyterian. I don't know if we have cradle Baptists or what we call it, but cradle Presbyterians are those who grew up in the church all the time. My background and upbringing was in northern Ohio in a Missouri Synod Lutheran Church, which is a pretty conservative branch of the Lutheran Church. Conservative enough where women don't teach Sunday school. Does that sound familiar? Have we heard that before in other denominations and things? In fact, for years, my mother told friends that I was just simply working in the church, and most people thought I was a secretary for a long time. So it went on. So I am not that. And then also, I am not actually a traditional Presbyterian ordained minister. I'm a lay pastor is what I am. We change our wording around on a regular basis, so I came in as a commissioned lay pastor. I am now officially known as a commissioned ruling elder, so that's my title. I'm at Covenant Presbyterian Church. Jerry and Sonia Paris, who are long-term members and good friends from the Jacksonville area, who are part of that church, are with us tonight, too, as well. So I serve there. I'm technically a member at First Presbyterian Church in Jacksonville, which is right off the square. Used to be really close to the Village Inn. When the Village Inn was there, that was kind of our marker. We were on that side of the square. So we're there. I get to still teach there. I do Wednesday Bible study and then a Sunday evening group, and I've got at least a few people from Sunday evening group who are here with us tonight. So we're glad to be here in a different venue doing something else. So I'm going to talk about Presbyterianism in the U.S. pretty much, but give a little history of that, so hopefully this doesn't get too boring. But we look at the Presbyterian roots of faith and how we come to that we call Reformed tradition, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We go into the history of the Reformation, and I'm sure you probably heard this in the different talks in different places here, going from in the Western world where we had only the Roman Catholic Church, and then Martin Luther around 1517 has the 95 Theses, and it really starts the Reformation. For those in the Baptist culture, we know that that's not really the only way it happened. It was percolating around. There was a lot of diversity starting in that time in a very conformed era, and so Luther is certainly part of that in Germany. And Luther really did not want to go out to start a new church. He really was looking at reforming what was there in the Catholic Church. And he really didn't speak to maybe the bigger issues that are out there sometimes in theology. He was really kind of there in a way for the peasants, for family life, and looking at the really corruption of the Catholic Church. And so he went on doing his thing. We then come to about 30 years later and a man named John Calvin. John Calvin was from France. He was in the Catholic Church. He wanted to be a scholar. He really just wanted to be an academic and live a nice, quiet life and write books. And he had written a book called The Institute sometime around, I think, about 1534, 36, somewhere in there. There's a couple different editions that comes out in. And so he comes to have a name, and he's traveling. He's traveling through Switzerland, and he's going through the town of Geneva, and someone finds out he's there, and so they corner him. and basically put a curse on him that if he doesn't stay there and help them in their new efforts at being a non-Catholic community, at that time, in this time of the Reformation, individual towns were voting as the citizenry to be Catholic or to be Reformed, or something other than Catholic, to be Protestant, we might say. And that had just occurred in Geneva, and they didn't have any leadership. And so here's this young academic who's written a book that everybody's heard of. And so they convince him that if he doesn't stay, that God will curse his studies and all of his quiet time. And so they convince him to stay for at least a couple of years. And he does. He spends about 2 years there in Geneva. And he starts to put into action some of the things that he has been writing about in this book of the Institutes. And it becomes very controversial because there are things, the authority of the church and the Roman Catholic Church had been there for years. Many of the people who had voted not to be Catholic thought they were getting rid of most of that authority and were going to have a lot more freedom. And in some ways, Calvin brought in a lot more structure than what they wanted. And so they push back against him. The final thing, I think, is an Easter communion, and there's a big debate over having leavened bread or unleavened bread, and Calvin won't be dictated to. So he and the other guy that's with him are kind of driven out of town, and he finally gets to go to Strasbourg and study for a few years. He does pastor a church there, and does that for about 3 years. And they finally convince him then to come back to Geneva. They don't have any leadership again, and so they need him to come back. And so he comes back, and then he really stays in Geneva the rest of that time of his life there. He's going to live, he's born in 1509, and he dies in 1564. Does not live a really long life, really uses his life up in service to the church and in study at that time. And so he begins this kind of systemic theology that is something other than Catholic. So how are we God's people, and yet with a very strong understanding of a church that we are nurtured through, and develops that in a variety of things. In some ways, there are some great and wonderful things that come out of that, and then there's some difficult things for those of us who look back in the history of that. It was not a tolerant time. There are burnings at the stake and things that are not really what we want to dwell too much on, but things that we have learned from in that process. When you start to have freedom and we have different opinions, what do we do with those who are outside of the box so far that we can't have them? And so that doesn't happen a great deal, but that does happen, and that needs to be dealt with in Geneva, and that is part of the discussion and history out of that time period. And so along with talking about theology, Calvin was a biblical scholar. He wrote commentaries on most of the books of the Bible, as did Luther. They were very much connected to the Word. As you remember, historically, the printing press is coming out. The Word is coming out to everyone, is much more accessible at least. And so that becomes a real focus of looking at the biblical story so that the common people can read the Bible and respond to God's Word and respond to ways of life in faith. And so that is a big part of what he does as well. He preaches nearly, I think it's 5 to 6 times a week. He preaches without notes for hours at a time. He is one of those that goes straight through the Bible verse by verse. The story is that he'd been there the 2.5 years before he left at that Easter confrontation. He comes back right at 3 years later, and he picks up on the verse he left off on in Geneva for those there. Very serious about understanding God's Word. And what does this mean? Very systemic and serious about where that is. With that becomes an organization of the church. How do we organize the church? That we're out of this Catholic structure, but how do we have some form and function and authority within the church? And so that's part of what comes through the Geneva experience. One young man that comes there is John Knox. You may have heard that name. John Knox comes from Scotland, and the Reformation, again, is percolating in the British Isles in a little different way, a little more armed conflict going on there between the Catholics and the Protestants. And John Knox makes his way to Geneva and studies under Calvin, and he picks up that message and then takes it back to Scotland. And so we have a kind of Scottish understanding, which is really much more similar to what becomes the American experience in the Presbyterian Church. We have a lot of immigration of Scots-Irish out of Scotland who come, when we come to this country, in the very early immigration patterns on the kind of Atlantic coast areas. And that is deeply influenced by John Knox, who again was directly in contact in Geneva with Calvin, and then brings those ideas of how to be the church, how to organize the church, to Scotland, and then from Scotland they come to America at that time. One of the things we talk about is our name. We are Presbyterians. It's kind of an odd name, okay? I think it goes back, if we translate, and the actual person who's been through seminary can tell us that. It's the Greek for elder. And so we come up with that. And so we hear that. We also, we talk in the Presbyterian Church, we have also geographic areas that are known as presbyteries, and that comes out of Scotland, and that is the model that comes to the U.S. This area in Alabama there are 3 actual presbyteries at this time in Alabama. There's a North Alabama Presbytery, a South Alabama Presbytery, and then the Central Alabama Presbytery is known as the Presbytery of Shepherds and Lapsley, and that's the one that our church is in. And so we have that. So it gives a kind of a geographical region. Originally that was because travel was difficult, and you wanted to get together and have discussion and worship together and study together. It was good to have us kind of an area to do that in. And decently and in order is a term you'll often hear with Presbyterians, and so they don't like to be loosey-goosey about where do I go or what do I do. These are what the boundaries are. This is what we do. So that's part of what we hear in our name, which is really about kind of the form of government that we have as Presbyterians. And I think you've probably heard from different denominations here and Methodists and things. And what I can say very clearly, I am not a spokesperson for the Presbyterian Church, is there is no spokesperson. There technically is not a hierarchy in that sense. There's not a bishop. There's nothing like that. What we have is the organizational bodies of the church. Each church has a session of elders who are elected by the membership of that church, who rule and make decisions. There is also then what we call the presbytery. As I mentioned, we're the Presbytery of Shepherds and Lapsley here. The ministers are members of that presbytery. They can come to meetings. We have quarterly meetings. If there's issues to vote on, they're going to vote on that. But also each church has to have representation. And so there's at least one other person, an elder who's not the minister, who goes as representation of that church. And again, very organized. If you have over 500 members, you get an extra elder to go. This may sound somewhat familiar. It's not a stretch to say that the U.S. Constitution and the form of government that we have is very related to a Presbyterian structure. It's simplistic to say that it's Presbyterian. It's not exactly that, but it certainly was influenced. The Constitution was influenced by those Scots-Irish Presbyterians who came with this decently and in order way of how we organize as the church, and then how we can organize as individuals and bodies of faith. And so all of that comes through. In fact, the first Presbytery meeting that was held in the U.S., or in America, because it's in 1706, before we're actually formed as the United States, was held in Philadelphia. There's a General Assembly where all the churches had representatives coming to them in 1789. John Witherspoon is the one who organized that and put it together. Well, John Witherspoon was a Presbyterian minister who signed the Declaration. And so we find that kind of very connected history with Presbyterians and those early people that came to the country in the colonial times in particular. And because they were coming from that Scots-Irish background, they were quite supportive of freedom, and so they were really pro-revolutionary. And so again, that shows the impact they have on the government that we end up with in this process today. So if you're frustrated with the government, please don't blame the Presbyterians, but there is a connection there within that process to see. Just a little side note, it's interesting. Presbyterians have always been disproportionately involved in the civic process, and that goes back to John Calvin. Calvin in Geneva was not just worried about the church. He was worried about issues such as sanitation and sewers. He made the first kind of public sewer system of covered sewers in Europe at that time, made sure the water was clean. And he really lifted up civil duties and people who were civil servants, that was really the highest calling we could have, to serve our fellow man in service to each other in those types of positions. And so we hear that connection through. I think right now there's about, 2 million Presbyterians, depends on how you're counting us, nationally in the U.S. And I think we're still around 35 or so of the elected members of Congress are Presbyterian. So still a very disproportionate number participate and take that very seriously as part of their response in a life of faith. We talked about, we had sessions that go to the local presbyteries. Twice a year we have what they're called these general assemblies. Not twice a year, every 2 years we have those. And that's when everybody comes together for a meeting. Again, we have lots of committee structure. We vote on things. There's no one person in charge. Lots of discussion, lots of debate. Very democratic form of government to look at issues and to vote on issues, to be a commissioner to General Assembly. This year is a General Assembly year. It's meeting in Detroit. We had, I think, 2006, we met in Birmingham, so it kind of rotates around the country in different places. And again, that's been going on since the 1700s, and it's the longest continually meeting group in U.S. history, I think, of any group of any kind, because it's been going back to 1700 something or other. So, all right. As Chris said, I have a lot of letters behind my name. We are PCUSA, Presbyterian Church of the United States of America. You will also hear other terminology for Presbyterian churches. I'm going to talk a little bit how, while it was Calvin's vision to stay together as one church, there often became divisions. One of the first divisions we had was very early after the Revolution. As the westward expansion came, there were these settlers who were Presbyterians who wanted to start churches, but again, very decently and in order, they were very concerned that Presbyterian ministers be seminary educated. And they just couldn't get them over here fast enough. We were just starting to build seminaries. They would send them over. Something would happen. They would die on the way there. Terrible, tragic stories if you read through the letters of the history. And so they just were not getting ministers to where they needed them in congregations. And so, as I'm sure you heard in the Methodist tradition, and Baptist traditions as well, they became less connected to having to have a seminary-educated person. And so there were Presbyterians who said, we just can't wait anymore. We're just going to ordain our own people and say it's a call system, much more similar perhaps to a Baptist system, to be a minister of the church. And so that became the first split, and that was the Cumberland Presbyterians. Have you ever heard that terminology? Cumberland Presbyterians split from the larger denomination in America at that time over ordination standards, we call it. They were much more similar to a Methodist or a Baptist sense of call as opposed to just a seminary education coming there. So that's kind of the first big one. And with that push for education in the Presbyterian Church, while it was difficult, one of the things is we have a history of being very committed to schools and to colleges. There still are in existence nearly 60 Presbyterian schools or colleges across the United States. Again, lots in the Atlantic coastal area coming on through this area. Stillman College is a Presbyterian school. It's a historically black university there in Tuscaloosa that was opened right around the time of the Civil War to train ministers for black Presbyterian churches. And that still continues today in our state here, and we have several others around going through that. So education has often been a highlight and a focus for us. Going back to Calvin in Geneva, he started some of the first public schools, and he was one of the first to educate women in Europe. For everyone who wanted to have access to education, Calvin really pushed that opportunity and provided that in Geneva through the church there. Okay, so the Cumberland split is the first split. The next split we have is probably not a surprise to any of us living in Alabama and in the South, is over the issue of slavery. It begins to splinter. There are groups that begin to splinter off as early as the 1830s in the Presbyterian Church over slavery issues. The total division, of course, comes in 1861, where you end up with separate northern and southern churches. And so that changes everything. Seminaries change. It changes. We have an organizational government that's supposed to get everybody together every 2 years. That changes, so they become entirely separate entities. Any idea how long it takes them to get back? Reunion is not until 1983, over 100 years. So it's really, and what comes out of that is there's such a long-term division. There become real differences in theological interpretation, particularly biblically, and so that becomes some of the battles, and that was some of the resistance. They had certainly tried seriously from the 1920s on to have a large-scale reunion, and some churches had come back in to the larger denomination. The Northern Church was the United Presbyterian Church of the United States of America. That's UPC-USA, if you want a whole bunch of letters to go with that. The Southern Church was the Presbyterian Church of the United States. UCUS, since that was the Southern Church, and they all come together to be the PCUSA in 1983, which is about the time I came to the church in 1986. It was just after reunion, so I hadn't had any experience before that. And so we still see some of the remnants of those differences in theology that we had from that over 100 years when we were separated, our seminaries were separated, what was emphasized was sometimes very different. And so very quickly, we started to have splits even before reunion, some of them over civil rights issues, and again, theological issues. Presbyterian Church in America, PCA churches are very prevalent in this area, Alabama in particular. Briarwood Presbyterian, which is a wonderful facility, wonderful church and outreach, very large church in the Birmingham area. Faith Presbyterian, which has the school in Anniston, is a PCA congregation. A little sidebar story is the church that I am at, Covenant Presbyterian, was given by a member who had already left. They'd committed the land to build a church in the Lenlock area, and then they were with the group that went to Faith. And so usually in a Presbyterian church USA, the congregation does not hold the property. The presbytery owns the property in the deed. And to do that. But in our example, that is not the case. I don't know if Jerry knew that or not. it was the Presbyterian did not know, but we know that, don't we, Jerry? We know it's not that. So it's really interesting. Right here, we have a lot of that history that plays out for us still, from that conflict of so long ago. And then again, here recently, it has been an issue again, mostly over ordination standards. And there are evangelical Presbyterian churches and 2 or 3 others that have splintered off. In fact, Selma Church, which has been part of the larger Presbyterian church forever, just split at our last Presbyterian meeting in May and decided to go with a more generally conservative denomination than what they felt the PCUSA was. And that's very, we've had some smaller churches go. That's certainly the largest church that we've had in our presbytery to make that decision and to leave. So, like I said, we're named in this area the Presbyterian of Shepherds and Lapsley. And what that is, Shepherds and Lapsley were 2 men. Mr. Shepherd was a black man who was a seminary student at Stillman College in the 1880s. And the Lapsleys were first in Selma and then in the Anniston area, were a white family. But they both went to be missionaries in the Congo, supported by the Southern Presbyterian churches of this area. And that's part of our history. The young man, Mr. Lapsley, went and I think he only survived about 2.5 years in the Congo before he died of fever. He'd been a top graduate at the University of Tuscaloosa, and I want to say he was 26 maybe when he passed away. It's a very young and very tragic story. And then Mr. Shepherd and his wife stayed and continued to do mission work for 20-some years in the Congo, supported by the Presbyterian. So after reunion, we had to rename everything and put everything back together. They decided to claim part of our history and use that in our name. So that's why we have a little bit of an unusual name of the Presbytery of Shepherds and Lapsley. We have about 86 churches here in this area. And so, like I said, we had, when we first moved here about 12 years ago, there were probably 90 or 92, somewhere in there. Some of the smaller ones have closed in more rural areas. And like I mentioned, we've had a couple that have gone to other affiliations within the Presbyterian church. All right, I want to talk just a little bit about what I call Calvin 2.0. If you ask most people in a general thing, what do you know about Presbyterians? In a theological context, they'll usually say, well, they're predestined, and that is a lot of the language and stuff. Actually, we don't talk about it that often. It influences some of how we see things, but Calvin introduced the topic. It was not central. I want to make that very clear. It was not a foundational aspect of his theology. It was part of his understanding of the sovereignty of God, which was central to Calvin's theology. That God is God and we are not. We should never limit God by our human limitations that we put on things. And tied to that, this idea of predestination, which he got some pushback on even in his life about where did you come up with this? Well, it wasn't new. It's in his Bible. We certainly can find passages that have a predestined kind of feel to them when you read them through. Augustine had touched on it earlier in Christian history about that, and Calvin really came to it from a place of how do we pastorally deal with families in the church who have a family member who does not participate fully in the life of the church, who seems to refuse to do that. And the family members pray and do everything they feel they can do for someone else. And really allowing people to know that relationship with God is God's business, and that people respond to God's irresistible grace, but we cannot force that for someone else. And that's really the main push of Calvin on that issue. What comes out in the generations after Calvin is kind of a stronger stance by some of the Calvinists, and we hear of tulip Calvinism. Has anybody heard of that? All right. Actually, that shows up much more in Baptist churches today than it does in Presbyterian churches. I can't even, it's total depravity and irresistible grace. Somebody else can go through all those details on that at some point if you want to afterwards. But that becomes really after the time of Calvin. I want to make it very clear that is really not Calvin's push. It comes in the generations after, and they become very solidified about that viewpoint and going forward. Today, that is not really the understanding of the Presbyterian Church USA in particular. We certainly, embrace God's sovereignty and work at living into that and responding always to God's love and God's grace that we see in our lives. And that's really how we see a life of faith. And as we develop that faith, we can respond more fully to that grace, and our lives are enriched in that process. Another thing I wanted to add about Calvin that I think has a really modern connotation is his focus on vocation. Calvin felt very strongly that all of us are called to serve God, to serve the church, to be followers of Christ, and that we all can do that in a variety of vocations that we have. Not just people who come to serve at the church, but that we all have a sense of what he called vocation. That there is a theological and divine understanding to who we are as people and the work we do in all of our lives in so many places. And I think of so many people that I know. I can think of people sitting here who do that in your life, that you represent your understanding and love of God, your understanding and relationship with Christ, we might say in different traditions, through how we live our lives and within our sense of call and vocation. So I think that is really an area that has been underdeveloped in understanding with Calvin, is that vocation and who we are is very important with that. As I mentioned, with Calvin was very, even though it's pretty traditional, in a lot of ways he is the beginning of what we might call the progressive movement, about we can do things better as a society, as a church. We can impact things and we can do things. We don't just throw up our hands and say, oh, well, God is sovereign, he'll take care of that. We are to work and to do whatever we can. That idea of work, you hear the Protestant work ethic, that it ties back to Calvin very strongly, a very strong understanding of that. Again, that 30-year difference between Calvin and Luther is extreme in the impact they have on society and culture. Calvin is in Switzerland. There's lots of trade. There's lots of people coming through. He is asked to make essentially theological decisions about all sorts of issues, from banking to how we live our lives. And so that becomes a much more integrated part of life of faith for him, that we have those questions, that we have those things, and we really put up that lens of how does my faith impact these things that I do. And that really comes to us from the Calvinistic tradition as part of what we do there. All right, I've just got some odds and ends. I kind of went through just an overview there. I do want to say very clearly that we share a lot together with this congregation. I want to say from a Presbyterian standpoint, I didn't know if Bob Ford would be here or not, but Bob Ford preached at the Presbyterian Church this Sunday morning, and I know he's preached here many, many times. And so theologically, we are very close, I will guarantee you, in a lot of those things. We may see them from a little different angle or come to them a little different in language about that, but very similar, I think, in a lot of things, particularly with this Cooperative Baptist fellowship that we have here. One thing is we are a creed-speaking church, and that is another separation that we had within the American Presbyterian movement. The Disciples of Christ churches broke off over creed-speaking. They decided they were tired of people arguing over what we put down on paper and what we said we believed, and they just weren't going to do that anymore. And so they kind of separated from us, but again, very similar theologically with that exception, in Disciples of Christ and Church of Christ in that way as well. With creed speaking, Jesus is Lord is pretty much what gets you in. We don't have to agree on every word that's there. We debate a lot of that within our tradition. We do have a book of confessions. It looks like a thick book, but a lot of that is catechisms with lots of questions and answers and back and forth format with that. We have had some modern creeds. At the time of reunion, we came with a brief statement of faith. That's the most modern creed that we have, and that was in 1983 at that point in time. We also have brought in, since that time, into the book of confessions, the Declaration of Barmen. Is anybody familiar with that? That is out of the Confessing Church movement during Nazi Germany's time. And those are the churches that made a statement to push back against the nationalization of the church and the government taking over the church. And the emphasis in that declaration is that Jesus is Lord. You don't get to take over the political party and take over the church and tell me what to believe. So it's a real claim to that. So even though that was written back in the 30s, it became and was added to the Book of Confessions maybe about 10 years ago. And so it's not just we write new ones, we review different things. We think each of the confessions has something to say historically about what was going on. And again, it's not that we have to believe every word or agree in an absolute way of what we understand that to be, but it is faith-seeking understanding, and we honor that as part of the history of the church, of the voices of the past, of how we have found faithful life together. Again, coming back to Jesus, we are a Jesus-loving church. We are very centered in that. That is a big part of our life. Really understanding the incarnation as that focus point of God is with us, and that there is a unique understanding and expression of God that comes to us from Jesus of Nazareth, who we know as Jesus, who is the Christ, who is the Messiah, and that is an experience that is open beyond just the confines of time. It did not end in that time that he was in Palestine. That is open to us and open to the church, and he is accessible to us. Connected to that, I certainly believe in the Spirit. Very much, Calvin was really entranced. We couldn't really call Calvin a mystic, but he certainly was overwhelmed by the power of the Spirit to speak to us, to bring us new understanding, to bring transformation to our lives. We're coming up on Pentecost. You know, it's just a reminder that's the birth of the church, and Calvin certainly understood and respected that, and we are still growing into how we are God's spiritual people. I certainly believe in resurrection, again, as the sovereignty of God, and that brings us within that union to God, that brings us abundant life and eternal life, that Christ has done what we cannot imagine and given us a place in God's grace. And so that's certainly part of who we are. We have two sacraments within the Presbyterian Church. We have baptism. We do baptize infants. Again, that came, Calvin changed a lot of things from the Catholic Church, but they always accepted a baptism from a Catholic church if someone came to the Protestant church from the Catholic faith. That was never challenged. That was, again, part of that, but certainly not only infant baptism. We have, believers' baptism, and we can be part of all of that and have a very large understanding of baptismal covenant. And as a sign of God's deliverance. We don't see it as it is the act of salvation, but as a sign of faithfulness, again, responding to God's grace and to God's love. The Bible is very central. That comes, again, from probably the time of the Reformation when the Bible gets translated and everybody's pushing that. Luther pushes it. Calvin pushes it. In the Jacksonville church, I've been to the Jacksonville Presbyterian Church, they actually process the Bible. It's an old Scottish thing to do. We don't do that in most Presbyterian churches, but that has been the tradition in that church. Our services are kind of organized with that decently in order type, and we're going to always have readings from Scripture. It's not just going to be somebody coming up to talk about that. Everything has to have at least some connection to Scripture within that process. We're going to hear God's Word and respond to God's Word is part of our worship service. And so those are kind of my odds and ends. I'm sure there's questions here. I went through a lot of history there, and I didn't want to do too much on that. I want to say it's interesting. Chris used the term, I think, big tent, and that was my closing moment, is that at our best, we are a big tent. At our worst, we're something other than that. So, but we just really love the fact that we have an ecumenical tradition that has come to be part of us. Particularly, you think of the church in Switzerland, the World Council of Churches, and a lot of that is still focused there. There's been a long history of that, and that is part of who we are. We certainly love to have interaction with other brothers and sisters in Christ, and we are enriched by that process. My girls would say they would be remiss that we're talking here about we lose churches, and we are. I think with a lot of us and a lot of the more mainline type denominations, we're older. So we need to put a bumper sticker is that we get more out of 75-year-old plus than anybody else I know. So we have tremendously faithful older people, and that is great. And so we do sometimes have a hard time connecting and getting in the younger group with that. But so we have that. We certainly lose some churches due to attrition and just getting smaller. We have some very vital congregations within this presbytery, just really great, wonderful churches that are really serving that nurturing role of the church, also not just for themselves, but for other Presbyterians and other people within their communities. And so that's very exciting. And then also we have a camp that is in the process of being built as we speak. We have a camp called Living River that's being built on the Cahaba. We have 400 acres down there. And are building a new camp and conference center there. So we're very excited about that. So we do have a real blessing of some really new things going on too, and just open to what God is doing for us, with us, and through us. So glad to be here. All right, questions? Okay.
Q&A time.
All right. Do I get to sit now in the comfy chair? Okay, I want the comfy chair. Okay. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Now, as we've done in the past, Nick's walking around with a microphone. He's not going to, well, he might throw it at you. But we're going to record your questions so we can hear them. And remember, keep them clean. So,
No dirty Presbyterian jokes.
Right,
oh,
right.
Man.
Yeah, no Presbyterian or Baptist jokes. First question. Who's going to go first?
I'm going to ask who. I know somebody mentioned that they had someone in their family background who was Presbyterian. Does somebody else have grandparents, aunts, uncle, or your background? Does anybody else have that? We have a lot of Presby Baptists. We blend quite a bit in that group. We have a lot there.
While they all decide who goes first, I'm glad you mentioned John Calvin a lot, because Calvinism, as we've talked about, that word Calvinism is not John Calvin to a lot of people today. I think you use the term Calvinism 2.0 or Calvin. I call it neo-Calvinism. And TULIP, because you mentioned that and I wanted to just throw that out there. TULIP stands for total depravity, which means we as human beings cannot choose God at all. Like, it's not, so we can't, we have no way of experience, or no way of choosing God on our own. The U is unconditional grace, which means there's no condition for grace. That's pretty self-explanatory. The L is what irritates everybody. Is limited atonement. That's the idea that Christ's death and sacrifice, his actions, his resurrection were not enough for all, but only for those who are elect. And so that's where it's like, ooh. And then the I is irresistible grace. I said unconditional salvation, irresistible grace, which means once God sets his hooks in you, you can't, like, turn away. And then P is perseverance of the saints, which is what we in Baptist lingo call once saved, always saved. So. All right. Sean, you got a question?
Yeah, in your preaching, do you follow a lectionary?
I do, usually, but I don't have to. I mean, that's not defined. In fact, there's plenty of Presbyterian ministers. The church I came to, a man retired, and I don't think he followed the lectionary at all. So that's probably my Lutheran imprint of my upbringing, and I like liturgical seasons and do that. But I've taken off a month or so here to do something else. But usually we follow that again. But again, it's a choice. It's certainly not dictated.
Roy's got a question.
Will there be a time in your ministry that you will be considered a pastor, a preacher, or whatever at your church?
Whatever I am, that's a
whatever
great thing.
you are, will you?
It is. It's very humbling not to have a real title.
Yeah.
I don't think, unless I would go to seminary, because they still hold that standard.
So
I have not been to seminary.
Okay,
I went to a lay pastor program which covered 8 courses of kind of the blocks of what you get in seminary, but not the languages, not Hebrew or Greek, and not some of the extra things. My personal way around that is I've been finishing up a counseling degree, because I really had to make the dilemma of do I want to go to seminary and do that, and Columbia would be the closest, which is not that far away. It's about 2.5 hours. It's in the Atlanta area. I could have done that. But I have 5 children here, and that just seemed too much of a commitment to make. And so I was open to the fact that a counseling degree I could do at JSU. And so I felt that could at least be used in ministry probably as much as what I was going to use in a seminary education, certainly probably more than Greek or Hebrew would have been. And so that's what we went.
How long have you been at Covenant?
I have been there about 3 years. I'd finished up my coursework about 3 years before that and had just filled in. Okay. I've worked in the church all my life. I did youth ministry in Arkansas at the church we were at in Conway, Arkansas. I joined the Presbyterian church when I was 18, had moved there to go to school, and did a lot of youth ministry, college ministry in that context, and then was able to work in mission and outreach and start a nonprofit through the church, working with teenage parents as a stay-in-school program, which is very Calvinistic. And so that really kind of sold me on the whole theological framework, and got a lot of support from the larger Presbyterian church for money to start up and to get that going. And so that's again, a very humbling thing that's been going on now. Virginia, how old are you? So 18, 19 years. It was before Virginia was born. I got to start that. And so so that really, so I've always had that passion and knew that I would serve in some way, and I really never thought that this would be what I would do. But in moving here and transitioning and things were different, that the opportunity came up. John Jenkins, who had been at First Church, was a lay pastor, and I was working with him with some youth things at First Pres in Anniston, and he really encouraged me to do that. And so I'm certainly very thankful and glad that I had that opportunity to do that. And people at Covenant are gracious enough to have me there. So.
If you haven't been to Covenant, by the way, it's a beautiful little church.
Beautiful
sanctuary.
I love the sanctuary.
It's around. We're an octagon. We're 1970s, just great, wonderful octagon, and it's a neat blessing.
Long time ago, I had privilege to sing at that church.
Did you? Oh, great acoustic.
Help with the choir.
Yeah.
But beautiful. Love the
Oh,
sanctuary.
great. All
Love
right.
the sanctuary.
We're thankful.
Maybe I missed this, but do you observe communion?
We do Eucharist. I started to say sacraments, and I got lost in the sacramental discussion. Yes, we have baptism and communion Eucharist. Yes, I think got left off of the
And
sacraments.
is that open to?
We are open to all believers, and we announced that we were an open communion table. And that's kind of a personal thing for me. I came from Missouri Synod Church, which is not open. And so it's very interesting to go back to church with my mother in the church where I was baptized and confirmed and married and not be able to take communion. And so, yeah, it means a lot to me to be able to say, and we certainly try it. We always give that invitation to the table that this is Christ's table. It is not our table. It is Christ's table open for all believers. And that's our invitation. I will say that's not always been the tradition of the Presbyterian Church. I feel like I need to backtrack on that just a little bit. That is where we are today, and probably in almost all PCUSA churches. You could be perhaps a little more conservative about that. But I know that when we had the history at, I think maybe 125th anniversary at First Presbyterian in Jacksonville, they reissued what were called communion tokens. And the sessions used to meet, you were an elder for life. You were all men, of course, at that time. And so you're an elder for life in the Presbyterian Church. And they would meet on, I guess, Sunday afternoons to determine for the next week if they were going to have communion, if you were worthy to take communion. And they would give you a token. I am so glad that is not part of my job responsibility, I will say. That is way beyond what I want to do. And so, yeah, that's been an evolving process of how open we are in the communion table.
For some reason, I just get the idea if you take communion enough, you get enough tickets to get a paper airplane or something.
I think you had to turn it back in. I think it was a metal piece, and I think when you came up, you gave it to the elder, and before you were able to go to have communion to go up. So,
Well, while they're still thinking, in the Presbyterian Church, you guys in worship have a prayer of confession.
we do.
Right? Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that's one of the things I really like about Presbyterian worship.
We do. We have pretty much a standard order of service. We begin with a praise, hymn, song, and then we go from praise to confession. And we can do a standard. There are pre-printed. The Episcopal Church does confession also. They do pretty much the same one every time. I personally choose to change it. We have. I could keep with a standardized one. I have some great liturgical resources that I work with and try to work with that, and try to tie it into what the word is going to be, what part of the message is going to come from Scripture to tie into that, or if there's something really timely or specific with that, and just going on in the world with that. It is a confession both on a personal level and then also for the community. It is not just forgive me of my sins. Personally, it always should be open that it's for the world. It's interesting, if you were on lectionary today, we're in John's Gospel, and we get in that prayer that Jesus has for the disciples, and we start hearing that of the world part of it, and just remembering that while we're separate, that is still who we are part of, and that we have plenty of Scripture reminding us that Christ came for the world. And I think there's a humbling aspect. That is part of that confession. We do have that each week. We do that in service.
Do you choose your own sermon? Do you choose your own?
Oh, yes. Oh, complete. Yeah, that is really, it's interesting that the only thing the minister really has control over in Presbyterian Church is you pick the hymns and you preach what you preach. And that's the session can control everything else. They can control order of service. They can control all of that if they choose to. Most of the time they don't do that, but they really have the power in the Presbyterian Church to do that. But they cannot dictate. There's all sorts of things about scruples and stuff we get into about that. But yeah, that is your call, and that is Spirit-led for you. So yes, you can preach what you want to preach.
You all may not understand or know this. Lynn mentioned that Bob was the interim here. I think we've talked about it before I came, and I think everybody knows Bob. You don't even have to say Bob. It's like Cher. It's just Bob. Bob would like that. I'm having lunch with him tomorrow. I'll tell him. I'll confess.
We are
to him
praising
that I
Bob.
said
Make
that.
sure you tell him that.
But we have that connection with PCUSA, but also passport camps that our youth go on. That's a partnership that CBF has along with PCUSA, and one of your former pastors, Barry Howard, got his D-Min from Columbia Seminary, a Presbyterian school. So, yeah. And then one of my former professors from Sanford is now at Stillman, and is was just installed as the pastor Brown.
Oh my goodness, I know him.
Presbyterian. Scrivener.
Yes.
Yeah, Joe Scrivener. He talks with his fingers.
Yes, he does.
like a big
I did
Muppet.
not know that connection.
Yeah. Joe Scrivener.
Yeah, and let me just say, Joe Scrivener came in, and that is part of the Presbyterian process. You call a minister as a church, but they have to be accepted by the body of Presbytery.
Because he was a National Progressive or American Baptist.
Right. Even whether you're PCUSA or you come from another tradition, you go to a committee on ministry to be reviewed and interviewed and all that, and then if they are approved from committee on ministry, you go to the floor of that Presbyterian meeting, and you have to provide a written statement of faith, and your faith journey is written, so everybody reads that. And then anybody can ask you questions who is there that day. And then they vote on whether you join the presbytery or not. And so that goes through for everybody. You get through that process, which is slightly intimidating. Because they can ask you anything. I did not know that connection. I would like to say they've always been there, but that's not exactly the case. We have, I think, ordained probably about 75 to 80 years. And again, the Northern Church was way ahead on that. That was one of the issues when they came back in reunion, was ordination of women. Civil rights issues were also part of that, but that was it. So the Northern Church was quite a bit ahead on that. It did not really become common until the last 20 or 25 years, I would say. There were here and there women, and women could attend seminary and do that. But again, you have to have a call. Someone has to call you to serve in a church, and that just didn't happen for a while.
PCA doesn't ordain women, is that right?
They do not.
To give you some perspective, the PCA would be sort of like the Southern Baptist
Similar,
of the
very
Presbyterian. I mean, in fact, how much time do we have? Al Mohler and Southern Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky may as well be PCA Presbyterians.
Yeah.
If he saw me say that, that's all right. But they may as well be PCA Presbyterians. So.
Yeah, there's some very deep connections there. Yeah, deep with that.
I guess this question is going to be for both of you. If I were to want to put this in my little personal handbook, what would be the major differences? Just name a couple.
I would say form of government is the biggest thing. Theologically, I would think we're very close. There's some order of worship and things that might be different. But again, this is, I'm assuming, a congregational church where a congregation decides. The Presbyterian Church really is not a congregational church. The congregation votes for the session members, and then the session members are the body that decides. But there is another lens of presbytery. Like if you call someone, it has to be approved by that body to do that. And again, the ownership of the land, for the most part, is owned in common by the presbytery for the good of the presbytery. So somebody can't get mad is the idea and just take your church and go. And if there's investment to, we loan money back to churches that need money and help support that. That would be, to me, that's the biggest. I don't know. What
Yeah, and you said you don't have a sacramental understanding of baptism or communion, right? It's symbolic, I guess.
Well, we say they're
monumental.
both sacraments. They're both
Okay.
sacraments.
But they're not. Do they instill grace, or are they symbols
A
of an
response
action?
of grace.
Response of grace. That
But they're
sounds
still
very
sacramental.
Calvinistic.
They are the
Okay.
two.
Well, that would be a difference.
That would be a
We're
difference,
very
okay.
much. And then, of course, to answer you, I might get in trouble saying this. There are some Baptist churches that govern themselves practically like Presbyterians. And what I mean by that is they have deacons who call themselves a board and basically run the church. You've heard me say this. Thankfully, we don't have. Most of y'all are in here, so we don't have deacons that are that way. Deacon comes from the Greek word diakonos, which means servant. And so Baptist, deacons are, in a sense, they take a step down, not a step up. And they're not elders, and they're not, traditionally as Baptists, they're not a board. It's called the diaconate. And so, but there are some that practically operate as Presbyterians by appointing. In fact, like the Church of Brook Hills in Birmingham, very Calvinistic in this new sense, and very much Presbyterian in that they have an elder rule form of church government. In fact, again, not to bring it back up, not to beat a dead horse, but that is what Al Mohler is teaching Baptist at Southern Seminary, is congregational rule is not the way, it's elder rule. And so so there are some, particularly Southern Baptists, who are, again, practically PCA Presbyterians. But those would be the major differences. And then, of course, infant baptism. We don't do infant baptism. So I think Jim got a question.
Early on, you was mentioning Reformed Church,
Yes.
and I had an experience back early on, Shirley, my wife and I did. We worked with a group in an area we was working with several years ago, and I was a new Christian, fairly new Christian. But our CBF group had all had to leave to go to speak, on the speaking. Well, anyway, we wound up working with a group that called themselves the Reformed Church.
Yes.
And I didn't know enough to know what
I started to go into that, and that's a different branch of history. I tried to say this in the Presbyterian. It is, some of the theology is going to be very similar. It will trace its roots back to the Reformation time period with Calvin and Zwingli and that group pretty much out of Switzerland. What we find is most of those churches, in fact, we just had dear friends who came, and he is a professor at a Reformed church in Iowa at Dordt College. And the Reformed Church, my understanding is that they came in the immigrant move more up in the upper Midwest. They came a little bit later, and they had kind of their own set ways, and they didn't want to join in with this Presbyterian way of doing things. So they just kind of kept their own, and the Lutherans did that in my German background. They just kind of brought everything straight over from Germany and just kept with that and that organization. And so it tends to be a little more conservative than a PCUSA church. It's not quite as simple to say it's a PCA church, but traces its roots very much back to Calvin in that understanding. But it is the Reformed Church. Sometimes it's called the Dutch Reformed Church, the Reformed Church of America, and those things. But a lot of them use, most of them go to conservative Presbyterian seminaries for their background.
And they're, which may be just confusing, like Reformed is also used as a code for this neo-Calvinism, as well as things like doctrines of grace. I forget what else they said, but you might like cruise church websites, and it'll say like, here the doctrines of grace. That's another way of talking about the tulip Calvinism. Yeah. So, but but yeah,
I should have
Dutch
tied in
Reformed
when I
is another.
mentioned, Calvin kind of on the progressive end, and that's a little bit of a stretch to say that. But with the understanding out of the Reformed School of Theology is reformed and always reforming. Yeah. That we are always open to what God is doing, that we never have a total grasp on what that is, and that part of our life of faithfulness is to be open to that process, to be open to God's sovereignty.
But there is.
There is. I say it's a very small group. It's probably about 250,000 people total in those churches, and there's not many in this area. I would say it's mostly upper Midwest, going maybe to the far west. We'll see those congregations.
Any idea why there are so few PCA churches in Calhoun County?
It's an interesting thing. In fact, that came up. One of the things I've been able to do the last couple of years is to serve on some committees of the Presbytery and working on how we vision for the future and what we're doing. And that really has been a point because many of our southern counties, we lost all the churches. That when the split came, when it came time for reunion, they all went PCA. And we have several counties that don't have any PCUSA churches. And there was just really good leadership here. You've heard of Phil Noble at First Presbyterian Church. I think that was probably a large part to his leadership at that time. He was there in the 60s. He was very committed. The Hodges and the Kreiders were here. We just had some really good, staunch Presbyterians who really kept that on. And then we did have some that broke off. First Presbyterian Church had 900 members at one time, and within about a 10-year period broke off. Faith was formed off of it, which is the PCA church, and then Covenant Ryan, and then those are mission churches, but they put a lot out with that. I think it was just some really strong leadership. At that time, it was the Presbytery of North Alabama, and I think they were really able to push back a little bit to that message from a theological standpoint. Anything else?
Any other questions?
Does anybody know, in that Baptist Presbyterian connection, you'll sometimes hear that when they talk about Billy Graham, that he's at Montreat in North Carolina. Has anybody ever been? I don't know if you've been to that place. That is kind of, we call it Presbyterian Mecca. It is the camp and conference center for the Southern Presbyterian Church was there. There was a college there at one time. And I think it's still actually there. It's just very small. But he lives there, and the reason he lives there is that Ruth Bell Graham, his wife, was the daughter of Presbyterian missionaries in the Southern Church. And when they were on furlough, the missionaries, I mean, it was a very organized system. I have to say, the Southern Church had a huge number. I think at one time had over 500 missionaries out at a time in world missions. We're very committed to that. Montreat served as the furlough area. They had places for them to come and stay when they were back stateside. And that is how he is located there. It was through her family and her family's connection there to the Presbyterian Church.
If there are no questions, any final comments?
Oh,
No.
glad to be here. Glad
Do-
to be here. Thank you for letting me stumble through. Stumbling through.
All right, just as a final opportunity, do you have any questions for us as church or as Baptist? Oh, you have?
Sonia.
Uh-oh.
Okay.
I remember when Barry Howard was the minister. I taught Barry Howard. He was one of my dear friends. Saw Barry Howard's house. And I remember the first women elders or deacons in this church. And I was wondering, do you still have women?
We still do. In fact, here's one of the first who was ordained.
I
And,
remember calling Barry because he was just, I think Lynn knows, I just pick out certain people and they're just in my heart, and he was one of them. And so I called him and I said, Barry, because being in the Presbyterian and the women having such a large part, I said, Barry, I am so thrilled that your church has elected some women elders. He said, no, I was mistaken then. We didn't elect any women elders. And I said, well, I saw it in the paper. He said, we elected elders. And some of them were women. So I remember the first time, and I just didn't know whether you still had.
Absolutely. In fact, raise your hand if you've been ordained here. 1, 2, 3, 4. We've got some. Yeah. And of course, we're open to women preaching. Did Bobby Burns say something? But we've also had women to fill the pulpit several times, and of course we do these ecumenical things. We're very not your average Calhoun County Baptist folk. So, all right, this is your last chance. Any and everything you've ever wanted to know about Presbyterianism, or anything you might think you know about Baptists.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you so
so
much
glad to be
again,
here.
Lynn. Thank you all of you for being here. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And I'm going to ask, as we've been doing, Lynn, if you would, to dismiss us. We can stand and be dismissed.
Lord, we thank you for this time to come together, and we are now at the time where we go out to serve you in your world. We ask that your peace surround us, that our hearts be emboldened to show your love to others. As we go to serve Jesus, who is the Christ, may we go in peace. Amen.